The year was 1836. Across the gray fog of industrial England, in a narrow street lined with smoke-black buildings, a baby cried his first breath. His name was John Edwin Bull. No one then could have guessed that this quiet child would grow into one of the strangest and toughest gunmen the American West ever saw. John's family lived a hard life. England in those days was crowded, noisy, and cold. The streets were full of factory workers, coal dust, and hunger. Little John watched men labor long hours for a few pennies. He saw women carry heavy loads through the rain. From the start, he knew one thing for sure. He didn't want to die in a dirty alley, forgotten and poor. He wanted more. He wanted freedom. As a boy, he often heard sailors talk about a new land across the sea, a wild place called America. They said gold shone in its rivers, and a man could start again with nothing but courage. The thought burned inside him like a spark waiting for wind. By his late teens, John had saved enough coins for passage on a ship. It was a rough voyage across the Atlantic. The ocean was endless. The nights were cold. The food was bad. But John never looked back. He stood on deck and stared westward, dreaming of wide skies and a chance to make his own name. When he finally reached the United States, everything looked different. The people, the towns, even the smell of the air. He began moving westward, following whispers of gold and opportunity. At that time, America was still growing. The frontier was a place of risk and wonder, part heaven, part hell. There were no clear rules, and a man's worth was often measured by how fast he could draw a gun. John wasn't a lawman, nor an outlaw, not yet. He was a gambler. Cards became his trade, and his calm eyes made men nervous at the table. He could read faces like books. In smoky saloons, filled with rough miners and drifters, he learned how to stay alive. You never turned your back. You never showed fear. People began calling him the Englishman. Some mocked him for his accent. Others respected him because he never lost his cool. Beneath the quiet, there was something sharp, a hidden strength that would soon be tested. In the summer of 1862, John found himself in the rough mining camp of Gold Creek, Montana. Gold Creek was no paradise. Tents, muddy roads, and armed men filled the valley. Every man there wanted fortune, and many would kill for it. The rumor that week was that a gang of horse thieves had been stealing from miners. When John heard it, he joined a small group that decided to bring the thieves to justice. They tracked the outlaws to a cabin deep in the woods. John carried a double-barreled shotgun, his hands steady, his heart calm. They kicked open the door. Inside were three men, rough and armed, C.W. Spillman, Bill Arnett, and B.F. Jermigan. They had been drinking, unaware that death was about to knock. "Drop your weapons," John said. His voice was quiet but cold. Arnett sneered and went for his gun. John pulled the trigger first. The blast filled the cabin with smoke. Arnett fell dead. The other two men froze. They dropped their guns and raised their hands. John's group tied them up and marched them back to camp. The miners held a trial. One of the thieves was hanged. For John Bull, it was the first time his name appeared in the newspapers. He was now known as a gunman, though he never thought of himself that way. To him, it was just survival. That shooting changed him. Once you've taken a life, something inside you never quite returns to what it was. John didn't talk much after that. He gambled, drank, and moved from camp to camp. But everywhere he went, people whispered his name. Some feared him. Some admired him. 2 years later, in Austin, Nevada, John faced a different kind of fight. The town was split. English miners on one side, Irish miners on the other. Tension ran high, and small arguments often turned bloody. To stop the constant duels, the townsfolk decided on a fair match. Fists only, no guns. Each group would send its best man. The English chose John Bull. The Irish picked their strongest miner. The fight happened in a saloon at the corner of Main and Cedar Streets. People crowded inside, cheering and shouting bets. The air smelled of sweat and whiskey. The bell rang. John raised his fists. The other man charged. They traded blows, heavy, brutal, endless. Blood splattered the floor. John took hit after hit but refused to fall. He fought like a storm, quiet on the surface but unstoppable underneath. 21 rounds later, the Irishman collapsed. The room erupted. John stood there breathing hard, his face bruised and bloody, but victorious. That night, the English side celebrated, and John's legend grew even larger. But victory always has a price. The fight drew attention, some good, some bad. Gamblers, gunmen, and outlaws began to seek him out. They wanted to test the man called John Bull. And John, restless as ever, never stayed long in one place. He drifted from town to town, Virginia City, Belmont, Helena, always looking for the next game, the next challenge. In Helena, he met a man who would change his fate forever. Langford M. Farmer Peel, another gambler with a deadly aim. The two became partners, sharing tables, whiskey, and winnings. For a while, life was good, but friendship among gamblers is fragile. Pride, money, and jealousy can turn partners into enemies overnight. For now, though, John didn't know that danger was waiting ahead. He only knew that the cards were turning in his favor, and the frontier was wide open. Each night, as he sat, under the oil lamps of a crowded saloon, he could feel the pulse of the West. Loud laughter, clinking glasses, boots on wood, and somewhere in that noise, fate whispering his name. He didn't come to America to be famous. He didn't want glory or gold medals. He wanted freedom, and the right to live by his own rules. But in the Wild West, freedom always came with a gun, and John Bull was just getting started. After months of drifting from one dusty town to another, John Bull's trail finally led him to Helena, Montana. It was the kind of place only the bold survived: wooden sidewalks, loud saloons, and men who carried six-shooters on their hips like belts of honor. Helena in the mid-1860s was a wild dream built on gold. Fortune and danger walked hand in hand there. The miners came for the gold dust, the gamblers came for the miners, and in the middle of it all stood John Bull, calm, polite, and deadly when cornered. He wasn't the kind of man who started trouble, but he never ran from it either. In one smoky saloon, John met Langford M. Farmer Peel. Peel was tall, sharp, and carried himself like someone who had seen too much. He was a former soldier turned gambler, just like John, a man of quick hands and quicker temper. The two made an odd pair. John, the quiet Englishman, played with patience and calculation. Peel, the fiery American, liked to boast, laugh loud, and draw attention. But together, they made money. Lots of it. They moved from table to table, saloon to saloon, their pockets filling with gold coins and respect. For a time, Helena buzzed with stories of Bull and Peel, the luckiest gamblers in the territory. But money changes men. And friendship in the West was fragile, like glass in a bar fight. No one knows exactly when the tension began. Some said Peel accused Bull of cheating. Others whispered that jealousy over a woman started it. Whatever. The truth, their laughter turned into silence and their partnership soured fast. One night they argued in the Greer Brothers Exchange Saloon, a popular spot filled with miners and gamblers. Words grew sharp, chairs scraped, hands drifted toward gun belts. Peel stood up, his face red with anger. He struck Bull across the cheek and shouted, "You're nothing but a lying English cheat." The room went quiet. John didn't move. He touched his bleeding lip and looked Peel in the eye. "You'll regret that," he said softly. Peel laughed and walked out into the street. Bull stayed seated, his mind turning like a wheel. He wasn't a man of rage, but in the frontier, insult was death. And no man insulted John Bull and walked away clean. The next afternoon, Helena held its breath. The two men met again in the same saloon, the Exchange. The crowd knew trouble was coming. Peel's hand hovered near his gun. "Let's end this, John," Peel said. Bull's voice was calm. "I am unarmed," Peel sneered. "Then stay that way." In a flash, Peel drew his pistol. The hammer clicked, a sharp sound like a heartbeat before thunder. The gun fired, missing Bull by inches. In the blink of an eye, Bull snatched a pistol from the bar counter. His shot came almost as fast as the first. The bullet struck Peel in the chest. The sound echoed down the street. Peel staggered backward, eyes wide, mouth open as if to speak. He collapsed onto the saloon floor, dead before anyone reached him. John Bull didn't run. He set the pistol on the counter and said quietly. He drew first. Word spread like wildfire. Langford Peel was dead, shot by his partner. The town roared with anger. Some called it murder. Others said it was justice. By nightfall, a mob gathered outside the saloon, torches in hand, voices demanding vengeance. "Hang him! Hang the Englishman!" they shouted. Inside, Bull sat calm, cleaning his hands with a cloth. He knew the sound of death when it came for him, and this was it. Then a man stepped between him and the mob, Marshal John X. Beidler, Helena's most feared lawman. Beidler, often called X, was a vigilante hero who had hanged his fair share of outlaws. But this night, he stood for the law. "No man dies without trial," Beidler shouted. His voice cut through the chaos like a whip. The mob hesitated. Beidler's gun in his hand was enough to make them think twice. He pushed through the crowd, took Bull by the arm, and led him to the small-town jail. "You'll face justice," he said. Bull nodded. "That's all I ask." The trial was short but fierce. Witnesses swore Peel fired first. Others claimed Bull had been waiting for revenge. Bull stood before the jury, silent, his face expressionless. When the judge asked if he had anything to say, he simply replied, "He was my friend, but he left me no choice." The jury couldn't agree. The vote split. In the end, the case was dropped. Bull was free. But his freedom came with a shadow. He packed his few belongings, left Helena the next morning, and never came back. Behind him, he left a grave and a story that would follow him forever. For John Bull, life became lonelier after that day. He had killed before, but this was different. Peel wasn't a stranger or a thief. He had been a friend. Every town he entered afterward seemed to whisper, "That's him." The man who killed Farmer Peel. Bull didn't deny it. He didn't brag either. He just played his cards, drank his whiskey, and moved on. He was no hero, but neither was he a villain. He was something in between, a survivor in a world that didn't forgive mistakes. From Montana, he drifted south to Cheyenne, then east to Omaha, and later Denver. Everywhere he went, he carried the same quiet presence. Polite, distant, and deadly if provoked. In Cheyenne, he ran a gambling table under an alias. In Omaha, he narrowly escaped another mob after a knife fight. In Denver, he worked the saloons until his body could barely keep up. But no matter where he went, the ghost of Langford Peel followed him. Sometimes, after a long night at the card table, Bull would sit alone staring at his hands, the same hands that had fired that fatal shot. He had crossed the ocean for a new life. But the frontier had turned him into something else, a man who lived between luck and death. By the late 1870s, the Old West was changing. Railroads stretched across the plains, towns grew bigger, and law replaced chaos. But John Bull belonged to an older world, one built on instinct, cards, and the barrel of a gun. He was already a legend among gamblers, the Englishman who outlived his enemies. But deep down, he knew the truth. You could win every hand and still lose the game. For every coin he earned, there was another scar. For every sunrise, another ghost, and yet he kept going. Because men like John Bull didn't know how to stop. The cards kept turning. The whiskey kept flowing. And death, the same death that had taken Peel, waited somewhere down the road. But if there was one thing John Bull had learned, it was this. As long as you can still draw breath, you've still got a chance to play the next hand. After the duel in Helena, John Bull vanished into the wide emptiness of the American frontier. The newspapers wrote about him for a few weeks. The English gambler who had shot his partner in broad daylight. And then the headlines moved on. But John never escaped the story. Everywhere he went, the shadow of Langford, Farmer Peel followed. The gamblers whispered it in saloons. The bartenders traded it like gossip, and drifters repeated it around campfires. That's John Bull, the man who killed his friend. He never denied it. He never argued. He simply lit another cigarette, pulled up a chair, and played his next hand. By 1869, the new railroad had reached Cheyenne, Wyoming, and with it came gamblers, thieves, and restless soldiers looking for trouble. It was a rough town where a man could lose his fortune and his life before sunrise. John arrived there quietly, carrying only a travel bag, a deck of cards, and a revolver. He rented a small room above a saloon called the Red Dog and spent his nights dealing faro. To most, he was just another drifter. To the few who watched closely, he was something else, a man who had seen death and didn't flinch anymore. One night, a drunken soldier tried to draw on him over a bad bet. The crowd barely saw Bull move. A single shot cracked through the music. The soldier's gun fell to the floor. Bull stood calm, smoke rising from his pistol. He didn't kill the man. He didn't need to. The bullet had grazed the soldier's arm, enough to make a point. Don't test the Englishman. From that night on, nobody did. In the early 1870s, John drifted east to Omaha, Nebraska, chasing a promise of bigger games and safer money. But the West always found him. On a hot July evening in 1873, outside the Crystal Saloon, a brawl erupted. A railroad worker named Samuel Atwood accused John Bull and another gambler, George Mahaffey, of running a crooked table. Words turned into shoves turned into steel, knives flashed under the lamplight. Atwood went down bleeding. Within minutes, an angry crowd surrounded the saloon, shouting, "Lynch him!" John and Mahaffey were dragged into the street, their hands tied. Someone threw a rope over a beam, but fate had its own sense of timing. Atwood, half-conscious and barely breathing, looked up at the mob and muttered, "It was the other one." Not him. The crowd hesitated. The sheriff pushed through, cut the ropes, and took both men to jail. When dawn came, Atwood was alive, and John Bull walked free again. He left Omaha before sunset, another town behind him, another ghost on his back. By 1880, John was older, thinner, but his eyes still carried that strange calm. He found work running card tables in Denver, a growing city where saloons glittered like gold. For a while, life almost seemed peaceful. But peace never lasted long around him. One night, a quarrel broke out with a drunk miner who accused John of cheating. The man drew a revolver and fired twice before John even stood up. The first bullet hit the wall. The second hit John's left arm. Bone splintered. He fell hard, his gun skidding across the floor. Doctors said the arm was beyond saving. Infection set in fast, and within days they cut it off at the shoulder. Most men would have given up then, one-armed, half-ruined, living on borrowed luck. But not John Bull. 3 weeks later, he was back at the tables, shuffling cards with his good hand, calm as ever. Someone once asked him, "Don't you fear death?" He smiled slightly. "Death and I have an understanding," he said. As the years rolled on, stories about him grew wild. Some said he had survived being shot 5 times. Others claimed he once pulled a bullet out of his own leg with a pocket knife. Every town added a new rumor, each one stranger than the last. But one thing was true. John Bull had a talent for surviving. In 1898, he was caught in another gunfight, this time over a woman. He took a bullet to the chest near the heart. The doctors couldn't remove it, so it stayed there, a cold reminder of how close he'd come. For more than 20 years, he lived with that bullet inside him. In 1921, when he was already in his 80s, surgeons finally removed it. A reporter asked what it felt like to carry death in his chest for so long. John laughed. "Heavy some days," he said, "but it kept me company." By the turn of the century, the West was changing fast. Railroads crossed the plains, telephones buzzed in new cities, and the old gunslingers were becoming stories for children. But John Bull was still alive. He lived quietly, traveling between small towns, dealing cards, telling half-forgotten tales to younger men who barely believed him. Sometimes he'd pause mid-story, smile, and say, "I've buried every man who ever tried to kill me." They'd laugh, thinking it was a joke. He didn't. To those who met him, he seemed like a ghost of another age, a living memory of the time when law was made by whoever had the steadiest hand. He'd walk into a bar, order whiskey, and the room would hush. There was something about him, the way he carried silence like a weapon. In 1929, the newspapers printed a small note. John Bull, noted frontier gambler and gunman, died this week at Vancouver at the age of 93. No photos, no fanfare, just a few lines about a man who had once stared down death and won. He died the way he lived, quietly, without fear, holding the last card of his long, strange life. John Bull's story isn't about glory or gold. It's about endurance. He wasn't a hero, and he wasn't a villain. He was something rarer, a survivor in a world that forgot most men by sundown. He crossed an ocean with nothing, faced death a dozen times, and still managed to see the world turn from horses to airplanes. Every scar told a story. Every bullet that missed proved his luck, and maybe, in the end, that was John Bull's greatest gamble. Not cards, not gold, not gunfights, but life itself. He played it to the very last hand, and somehow he won. By the time the new century began, the world John Bull once knew was gone. The dusty trails had become train tracks. The wild saloons where men gambled for gold had turned into quiet cafes. The echo of gunfire had been replaced by the hum of the telegraph and the whistle of locomotives. But John Bull, the man who had crossed an ocean and outlived his enemies, was still alive. He was old now, gray-haired and slower to move, but his eyes still had that calm, watchful look that made men uneasy. He had walked through nearly every danger the West could throw at a man, and somehow he kept walking. People began to whisper that he couldn't die. Some called him cursed. Others said he was blessed. In the early 1900s, John Bull wandered from town to town. He never stayed long anywhere. In each new place he would find a small room, a table to deal cards, and a quiet corner to drink his whiskey. He didn't own land. He didn't build a house. He carried his life in a single bag, a deck of cards, a pocket knife, and a few yellowed letters that no one ever saw. Sometimes, when asked about his past, he would just smile and say, "I've outlived it." The world had changed around him, but John didn't seem to notice. The old instincts were still there. Sit with your back to the wall, trust no man too quickly, and never let your gun be far from reach. In many towns, younger men had never even heard his name. To them, he was just an old gambler with strange stories. But the older ones, those who remembered the wild days, would look twice. They'd whisper, "That's him. The Englishman." As the real West faded, the stories about John Bull began to grow like tall grass. Some said he once stared down 4 gunmen in a saloon and walked away untouched. Others claimed he survived a knife fight in Deadwood, crawling half a mile through snow to live. None of those tales were written down. They spread by word of mouth, from bartender to traveler, from one dusty town to the next. Each telling made John a little larger, a little tougher, a little more immortal. He never corrected them. When asked if the stories were true, he would shrug. "Believe what you want," he'd say. Truth never did sell as well as legend. In a world hungry for heroes, the idea of a man who had cheated death again and again was irresistible. In 1921, a curious newspaper reporter tracked him down. The journalist had heard the rumors. The duels, the amputated arm, the bullet in his chest that doctors had never removed. He found John living in a small boarding house near the Canadian border. The old gunman was sitting by a window, reading a tattered deck of cards like they were memories. The reporter asked him about the bullet. John nodded and tapped his chest. "It's still in there," he said. "Right next to the heart. Doctors wanted to take it out years ago. I told them to leave it. It's part of the story." Then he chuckled. "Guess I was wrong about that. Hurts when it rains." The reporter wrote down every word. Later, when surgeons finally removed the bullet, John sent it to the journalist with a short note. "You wanted proof. Here it is. It's been my roommate for 20 years. The story ran under the headline, "Old Gunman Still Carries His Past in His Chest." Readers loved it. For a brief moment, John Bull was famous again, the living relic of a world long gone. As the 1920s rolled forward, time finally caught up to him. His friends were gone. The saloons he once ruled now served coffee, and the young men laughed at tales of gunfighters. John didn't mind. He'd had his time. He spent his final years in Vancouver, near the cold edge of the Pacific, far from the deserts where his legend began. The sea reminded him of England, the place he'd left as a dream-chasing boy nearly 70 years before. He was almost 90 when he took his last walk along the harbor. Those who saw him said he moved slowly but proudly, a cane in one hand, a cigar in the other. He would stop sometimes to tell a stranger, "I once knew the West when it was wild." Most would smile politely, thinking he was just another old man with stories. They didn't know those stories were true. In 1929, after nearly a century of wandering, John Bull passed away quietly in his sleep. No family, no funeral crowd. Just a few neighbors who barely knew who he was. The newspapers gave him a few lines. John Bull, English-born gambler and frontier gunman, dies at 93. And that was it. No mention of the men he'd faced, the blood he'd shed, or the world he'd survived. But for those who understood, his death marked the closing of an era, the last whisper of the true Wild West. Decades later, historians digging through old court papers and frontier records stumbled upon his name again. John Edwin Bull, born in England, gambler, gunman, survivor. They pieced together his life from scraps, trial transcripts, saloon ledgers, and forgotten news clippings. What they found was astonishing. A man who had walked side by side with legends, who had outlived gunfights, mobs, and time itself. Authors began to call him the Forgotten Gunfighter. In books like Deadly Dozen, Forgotten Gunfighters of the Old West, his story was told once more, the quiet Englishman who came to America chasing gold and left behind a legend of iron. John Bull's story is not one of glory, but endurance. He was not the fastest gun, nor the most famous name, but he was the one who lasted. While others fell in duels, hangings, or back alley brawls, John simply kept moving. Maybe it was luck, maybe it was will, or maybe he just knew how to read life like a poker hand, when to fold, when to play, and when to walk away alive. In a world where courage was often mistaken for foolishness, John's courage was quiet, steady, and patient. He didn't die with a gun in his hand or a crowd cheering his name. He died in peace, something rare for a man who'd lived by the gun. Today, his name barely appears in textbooks, but every so often, a Western historian or storyteller uncovers his tale and tells it again, how an English gambler became one of the last true gunmen of the frontier. They say legends never die. Maybe that's true, because as long as someone remembers John Bull, the Englishman who refused to die, the echo of the Wild West still rides on the wind. When John Bull took his final breath in 1929, the world barely noticed. No crowds mourned. No gunshots saluted. No songs were sung. The same newspapers that once called him the English gunman now gave him only a paragraph. The Wild West had turned into history books and Hollywood scripts, and the real men who built its myths were fading into dust. John Bull, the man who couldn't die, had finally done just that. Quietly. Within a few short years, his name slipped from memory. While legends like Wyatt Earp, Doc Holliday, and Wild Bill Hickok became famous in dime novels, John Bull's story disappeared between yellowed pages and forgotten archives. Why? Because Bull wasn't the kind of man who told his own story. He never hired writers. He never sought glory. He lived, survived, and moved on. In an age that rewarded loud heroes, he was silent. And silence doesn't make headlines. The history of the frontier became a contest of fame. The gunmen who bragged, who posed for photographs, who spun tales of honor and vengeance, they became legends. But men like Bull, who walked away from fights and refused to boast, vanished like footprints in desert wind. By the 1930s, the image of the Old West was no longer real. It belonged to the movies. In black and white films, cowboys wore clean hats, gunfights were noble duels, and justice always won. There was no place in that story for a quiet English gambler who fought only to survive. Hollywood wanted clear heroes and villains. John Bull was neither. He lived in the gray, the space between law and chaos, and audiences weren't ready for that yet, so his name stayed buried, even as 1,000 other gunmen were reborn in shining celluloid. In truth, part of his life was simply lost to time. The West of the 1860s and 1870s wasn't a place of paperwork. Court files burned in fires, newspapers folded, and witnesses died. Historians later found fragments, a trial record from Helena, a saloon ledger in Cheyenne, a faded obituary from Vancouver. Each scrap told part of the story, but none gave the whole picture. It was as if the frontier itself had decided to keep his secrets, and perhaps that was fitting. John Bull had lived by vanishing, slipping from one town to the next, leaving behind nothing but whispers. Even among scholars of the Old West, Bull was often mistaken for other men. His name, simple, common, almost symbolic, blended into legends and nicknames. John Bull had been a term for England itself, a caricature used in newspapers to represent the British people. So when historians saw that name in early Western papers, They sometimes assumed it was a joke, a nickname, not a real man. Only later, when careful researchers dug deeper, did they realize that John Bull wasn't a cartoon. He was flesh and blood. An immigrant, a survivor, and a ghost hiding behind history's irony. It wasn't until the mid-20th century that his story began to resurface. A historian named Robert K. DeArmond, while researching obscure gunfighters for his book Deadly Dozen, stumbled upon the name John Bull buried in old Montana newspapers. The more he looked, the stranger the story became. Here was a man who had crossed the Atlantic, fought duels, survived mobs, lost an arm, and lived into his 90s, yet no one remembered him. DeArmond called him the forgotten gunfighter. And slowly, the silence around John Bull began to break. There's another reason his legend dimmed. John Bull's story didn't fit the moral codes that later storytellers liked. He wasn't noble like Earp, tragic like Hickok, or reckless like Billy the Kid. He didn't fight for law or revenge. He fought only when pushed. His life wasn't a clean tale of justice. It was messy, human, real. In the frontier, survival was everything. John Bull embodied that truth, the idea that courage wasn't about glory. It was about endurance. But endurance doesn't make a catchy headline. It doesn't sparkle like a duel at dawn. So history, chasing drama, passed him by. Those who study him today find a man of contradictions. A gambler who hated cheats. A killer who never bragged. A drifter who lived by a quiet code, never strike first, but always finish what's begun. He wasn't a hero. He wasn't a villain. He was a mirror, reflecting the rough world that made him. When modern writers try to capture his story, they see not the thunder of gunfire, but the slow burn of a man who simply refused to quit. In many ways, that's more powerful than any duel. Today, if you stand in the old streets of Helena, Montana, the saloon where Bull shot Farmer Peel is long gone. The wooden sidewalks have turned to pavement. The mountains still rise in the distance, quiet and unmoved. But the world below has changed. Yet if you listen closely, when the wind blows through the pines, it almost sounds like footsteps, slow, steady, unhurried. Maybe it's just the wind. Or maybe it's the ghost of John Bull, still walking, still watching, still undefeated. In Cheyenne, a few locals claim his spirit haunts the corners of the old Red Dog Saloon. In Vancouver, where he died, a small grave believed to be his lies unmarked. A man forgotten by history, but not by the land he refused to leave. In recent years, historians, filmmakers, and storytellers have begun searching for the real West, not the movie version, but the raw truth beneath. And in that search, John Bull's name appears again. Podcasts, documentaries, and online archives now retell his tale, the English drifter who came for gold and found legend instead. Each retelling adds life to the man history once buried. For every viewer who hears his name for the first time, the legend breathes again. And maybe that's the justice he waited for all along. Not fame, not riches, but remembrance. John Bull didn't want statues or songs. He didn't need a headline or a hero's crown. All he wanted was a fair deal, a clean game, and one more chance to turn the cards in his favor. He played his life like a long hand of poker. Carefully, patiently, until the very last card was drawn. And maybe that's why, a century later, we're still talking about him. Because in the end, true immortality isn't loud, it's quiet. It lives in the stories whispered long after you're gone. He crossed an ocean for freedom. He walked through violence and came out the other side. The world forgot his name, but it never erased his story. John Bull, the gambler, the gunman, the survivor, still rides somewhere in the dust of the American West. And if legends are just truths that refuse to die, then John Bull is still alive. Long before history forgot his name, John Bull lived by rules that no one ever wrote down. A private code built not from books or laws, but from experience. He had seen what greed could do to men. He had watched friendships turn to ashes, fortunes vanish overnight, and guns settle every argument. Through it all, he learned one truth: if a man has no code, he has nothing. From his earliest days in the West, John carried a simple belief: a gun was not for show. He hated men who used it to scare others. In his eyes, the loudest men were always the weakest. He never bragged about being a shooter. In fact, he rarely mentioned it. But everyone around him knew. If John Bull's hand ever went to his holster, it was already too late. He lived by the rule, never draw first, but never draw late. That philosophy kept him alive through dozens of saloon fights and cardroom standoffs. When someone tried to test him, a drunk, a sore loser, or a fool, John would stay calm, his voice low, his eyes steady. More often than not, his silence scared them more than any threat could. If they backed down, he'd pour them a drink. If they didn't, well, history already told how that ended. To John Bull, gambling wasn't sin or crime. It was life in miniature. Every card game was a mirror of the world, full of risk, deceit, and the faint hope that luck might smile one more time. He hated cheaters. In a land where money could buy almost anything, cheating was the one act he truly despised. When John dealt cards, he made sure the table was fair. If someone tried to stack the deck, he'd stop the game cold. No shouting, no second chances. Play straight or walk out, he'd say quietly. That quiet tone carried more weight than a sheriff's badge. Men listened, because John Bull's fairness was as dangerous as his temper, and no one wanted to test which would show first. For him, cards weren't about winning gold. They were about control, the art of reading a man's soul before he played his hand. That was John's real gift. He didn't just gamble with cards. He gambled with people. John believed loyalty was the highest stake of all. He didn't trust easily, but once he did, he stood firm, until betrayal forced his hand. Langford Farmer Peel had been the only man he called a true partner. Their friendship, and its tragic end, marked him forever. After Peel's death, John never again formed close bonds. He shared drinks, laughter, and the occasional card game, but not trust. He learned the hard way that loyalty was a two-edged sword, sharp enough to protect you, but sharp enough to cut you when turned. So he kept people at arm's length. Not out of coldness, but survival. The frontier was full of men who stayed too long and paid the price. A gambler who lingered in one town eventually made enemies. A gunman who bragged too loud found challengers waiting in every doorway. John's answer was simple: never stay put. When the air grew tense or the whispers got too loud, he'd disappear before dawn. No goodbyes, no farewells. Just a quiet exit, leaving behind a half-empty bottle and a story that would grow bigger in his absence. He drifted from Montana to Nevada, from Wyoming to Colorado, from Denver to Vancouver, a ghost with a gambler's grin. Some called it running. John called it living. John Bull had faced death more times than anyone could count. Gunfights, ambushes, lynch mobs, sickness, and yet each time he walked away. He didn't believe in luck, not really. He believed in odds. To him, death wasn't an enemy, just another player at the table. Once, when a reporter asked if he feared dying, he smiled faintly and said, "Fear it? No, I've met him before. He folds easy when you don't blink." It was that calm defiance, that quiet conversation with fate, that made his story almost supernatural. He didn't seek death, but he didn't hide from it either. If it came, he'd play his last hand fair and square, and maybe that's why death took its time with him. John Bull wasn't a man of speeches. He never shouted, never swore loudly, never boasted. His silence was his armor. In a world where men built reputations by bragging, John built his by not talking. He'd sit at the edge of a noisy saloon, listening to voices, footsteps, breathing. He could tell who was nervous, who was bluffing, and who was about to reach for steel. That ability to read a room saved him countless times. Violence often began with noise. John Bull survived because he waited for the quiet before the storm, and struck when it came. For all his hard edges, John had one soft spot: the dead. He never mocked the fallen, no matter who they were. After killing Langford Peel, witnesses said John stayed beside the body for several minutes, his face unreadable. He later told a friend, "He was a fool, but he was my friend. I'll not speak ill of him." That small moment revealed more about John than any legend. He wasn't proud of his kills. He didn't wear them like trophies. He carried them like weights, silent reminders of the price of survival. John Bull's code wasn't about right or wrong. It was about balance. In a land where chaos ruled, he created order, his own order. He never chased glory. He never begged forgiveness. He simply played the game by his rules and accepted the cost. Many men died trying to live like heroes. John Bull lived by being honest about what he was, a survivor. He once told a bartender in Denver the difference between a dead man and a live one. The live one knew when to walk away. It wasn't courage that kept him alive. It was understanding. The rare kind that comes only to men who have seen too much and lived long enough to tell it. Today, historians call him a forgotten gunman, but maybe that's exactly how he wanted it. Fame would have broken his rules. It would have made him loud, visible, predictable, and dead. Instead, John Bull lived his life by the quiet code of the survivor. And though the West changed and the saloons turned to museums, that code still whispers through the stories of men who refuse to quit. In every gambler who plays fair, in every fighter who draws only when he must, there's a piece of the Englishman's spirit, unshaken, undefeated, and silent. The frontier made men and broke them just as fast. For every gunfighter who carved his name into history, a dozen more vanished beneath the dust. But John Bull, the English gambler with a calm stare and a survivor's soul, somehow stood in the narrow space between life and legend. He was no outlaw. He was no hero. He was something in between, a man who walked the edge of death and somehow never slipped. John Bull was never a showman with weapons. He didn't twirl revolvers or pose for photographers. But when the time came, his draw was pure lightning. He carried two main guns through most of his life, a Colt Navy .36 caliber revolver, and later, a Smith & Wesson Model 3 Schofield .45. Both were clean, well-oiled, and handled with quiet care. He never fired unless he meant it. Old gamblers remembered the way he would rest one hand on the table, fingers tapping softly, almost like a metronome counting the seconds before trouble started. The moment someone made a move, that rhythm stopped, and the world exploded. He once told a young cowboy in Denver, "It's not how fast you draw, it's how calm you stay before you do." That calm was what set him apart. Where other men shook with adrenaline, John's pulse stayed steady. It was as if he and the gun were one, both part of the same silent machine that knew exactly when to act. Gold was both promise and poison in the Old West, and John saw what it did to people. In mining towns like Gold Creek, Belmont, and Virginia City, men killed for a handful of dust. He played cards with dreamers who struck it rich one night and were dead in an alley the next. John never chased gold himself. He called it the devil's bait. But gold followed him anyway, across tables, through duels, into pockets stained with blood. One story from 1869 told how he won 3 sacks of gold coins in a single game, only to give half back to a miner who had staked his last claim. When asked why, John replied, "You can't buy luck, and you shouldn't steal it either." To him, gold was just a temporary guest. It came, it went, and it always demanded a price. He'd rather keep his life than his winnings, and that simple truth saved him more than once. In the winter of 1875, somewhere between Cheyenne and Laramie, John rode with a wagon train carrying supplies, and, secretly, a chest of casino money bound for Denver. Word got out. At dusk, 5 masked riders appeared over the ridge. Gunfire split the cold air. Horses screamed. John's wagon driver fell, hit in the shoulder. With his one good arm, Bull fired from the sideboard, calm and precise. 2 bandits dropped. The others circled wide, shouting for him to surrender. He waited until the echo of their voices vanished behind the rocks. Then he climbed down, reloaded, and walked straight into the dark. They never found the remaining robbers. Some said he killed them all. Others whispered they ran after seeing his shadow in the firelight, thinking it was death itself. John never confirmed the story. When asked later, he said only, "The night's quiet when it's done." Omaha never forgot the night of July 12, 1873. It began with a crooked game and ended with screams in the street. Samuel Atwood, a railroad worker with too much whiskey in him, accused John and his partner of cheating. Before the sheriff could step in, Atwood lunged with a knife. John grabbed his wrist, twisted, and drove his elbow into the man's ribs. The knife fell. The crowd gasped. Then someone else, drunk and eager for chaos, swung a bottle at John's head. Glass shattered. John staggered but didn't fall. He drew his revolver with his good hand and fired into the air, one warning shot. The mob froze. That single gunshot might have saved his life. The sheriff arrived minutes later to find Bull bleeding from the scalp but standing steady, his pistol still raised. That night, Omaha learned what Helena already knew. John Bull didn't bluff when it came to survival. Of all his injuries, none was more famous than the bullet he carried near his heart. It came from a fight in 1898. Details lost to time, but the wound nearly killed him. Doctors said removing it would be fatal. So he lived with it for over 20 years. He used to joke, "That bullet's the only thing that never left me." Whenever it rained, the old wound ached. But John called it his barometer of survival. He said the pain reminded him that luck always had a cost. When surgeons finally removed the bullet in 1921, he held it in his hand for a long time. Then he smiled faintly and said, "Well, looks like you finally folded." Even a man as calm as John had ghosts. He never spoke of them, but people could see it. The way his eyes lingered when a song reminded him of the old days. The way he drank slower when the room got quiet. He saw too many deaths to count. Langford Peel, the soldier in Cheyenne, the miner in Denver, all burned into memory. Sometimes he'd sit alone by a window, watching the street lamps glow against the night, and whisper, "They all come back when the cards are down." Whether he meant ghosts or guilt, no one could tell. But the truth was simple. He carried both. By his 80s, John Bull had become a living myth. Newspapers called him the man who refused to die. Young men came to see him just to ask if the stories were real. He'd grin and say, "Half of them." I'm not sure which half. That was his charm. Mystery wrapped in understatement. He never claimed to be fearless. He was just practical. "Fear keeps you sharp," he said once. "Pride gets you killed." And maybe that was why. When others met their end in blazing glory, John Bull simply kept living. One cautious step, one quiet breath, one lucky card at a time. In the end, his weapons outlived their purpose. He kept his old revolvers polished until the last years of his life, though he no longer carried them. They sat on a shelf, gleaming faintly in the dim light of his Vancouver room. Reminders of the wild days when life was a gamble and every dawn felt borrowed. When he died, no one claimed the guns. They disappeared, just like their owner, folded back into the dust of legend. The West was full of ghosts, but none like him. He crossed oceans, outdrew death, and carried his own past inside his chest. He didn't die in a gunfight or under a hanging rope. He died quietly, as if even death had learned to respect him. John Bull, the English gambler who couldn't be killed, the man who turned survival into an art. The last echo of a time when courage was silent and every sunrise was a second chance. By the time the world learned his name again, the Wild West had already turned into legend. The gunfighters of old were no longer men. They were stories, heroes and villains drawn in black and white. Wyatt Earp was the law. Billy the Kid was the rebel. Wild Bill Hickok was the tragic gunslinger who never saw the bullet coming. And somewhere between them all, in the space no one remembered, stood John Bull, the Englishman who refused to die. Unlike the others, John never chased fame. He didn't stand for the law and he didn't stand against it. He simply lived by his own code, quiet, steady, and unbroken. When reporters searched the archives, they found his life written in fragments, a gunfight here, a trial there, a single line in an old newspaper. He'd never left a clean story behind, just traces like footprints washed by rain. Yet when historians pieced those fragments together, a picture began to form. A gambler who crossed oceans, fought duels, lost an arm, took bullets, and still lived to 93. Not the loudest man in the West, but the last one standing. Billy the Kid died at 21. Wild Bill Hickok died at 39. Jesse James didn't see 40. John Bull lived long enough to watch trains replace horses, telephones replace telegrams, and airplanes cut through skies that once belonged to eagles. He was the bridge between the old world and the new, proof that not every gunfighter had to die young to earn a story. His legend wasn't written in blood but in time. He didn't conquer the West by killing it. He survived it. To many, that made him even rarer than the rest, but endurance always came with a cost. The longer John lived, the lonelier he became. He had no family, no home, no roots. Every friend he ever made was buried somewhere behind him. Every town he'd called his own eventually forgot his name. Sometimes, when he'd sit at the corner of a saloon in his later years, younger gamblers would mock his slow hands and silver hair. They didn't know who he was. They saw an old man, They didn't realize they were sharing whiskey with the ghost of the Wild West itself. He never corrected them. He just smiled, played his hand, and usually left with their money. The American frontier had always been painted as loud, gunshots, galloping horses, and men shouting under desert suns. But John Bull's West was quiet. It lived in the shuffle of cards, the soft click of a revolver's hammer, the silence after a man made a choice he couldn't take back. He believed the real frontier wasn't out there in the deserts. It was inside every man's chest. The fight to stay alive, to stay honest, to stay human. When the world remembered only the noise, John Bull became the silence that held it all together. Most gunfighters were born of the frontier. John had come from across the ocean. He carried an accent that made him a stranger everywhere he went. Men laughed at him for it in his early years. But the Englishman's edge wasn't in his speech, it was in his discipline. Where others acted on impulse, he acted on patience. He never let pride pull the trigger. He fought when cornered, never before. That small difference saved his life again and again. People said he played gunfights like card games, calculated, emotionless, and fair. And just like at the card table, he rarely lost. Historians often wonder why John Bull survived when so many others didn't. Was it skill? Luck? Divine humor? Maybe it was something simpler. John never tried to be more than he was. He understood that life, like gambling, wasn't about winning every hand. It was about staying long enough to see the last deal. That quiet understanding made him timeless. He lived by instinct, by a slow, unshakable rhythm that modern men forgot. In a way, he represented the part of the frontier that never really died, the part inside all of us that refuses to give up, even when the world moves on. When his story resurfaced in the 20th century, people didn't quite believe it. They thought it was a tall tale, another frontier myth blown out of proportion. But the records were there, the court case in Helena, the articles in Omaha, the death notice in Vancouver. Everything was real. And that's what made him extraordinary. He didn't need exaggeration. The truth was enough. He wasn't the fastest, the richest, or the most famous. He was the last. The last of a kind of man who lived by instinct, not legend. Most legends die in fire and noise. John Bull faded like a sunset, slowly, beautifully, and completely. He left behind no family name, no monument, no grave marked with gold, but immortality doesn't always wear a crown. Sometimes it hides in the quiet spaces between stories, in the pause between one gunshot and the next, in the silence after a card lands on a table. That's where John Bull lives. Not in fame, but in the spaces where history forgets to look. If there's a lesson in his story, it's this. You don't need to be loud to be legendary. You don't need to be perfect to survive. And sometimes the greatest victory isn't outdrawing your enemy. It's outlasting your world. John Bull's life reminds us that legends aren't just born in glory. They're forged in endurance. He proved that you can be human, flawed, and tired, and still unbreakable. He showed that silence can be strength, that patience can be courage, and that even the smallest life can leave an echo if it lasts long enough. The West died long ago, but its ghosts still ride the wind. Among them is an Englishman who came with nothing but cards and courage. He didn't become a hero or a villain, just a survivor. John Bull, the man who outlasted the Wild West, not immortal in body, but immortal in story. The immortal frontier itself. Time has a way of turning men into memories, and memories into myths. For nearly a century after his death, John Bull was little more than a name buried in the dust. A rumor in the archives of Montana, a faint shadow in old saloon records. But legends have a strange power. They wait, they sleep, and when the world is ready, they wake again. The rediscovery, it started quietly, the way most great rediscoveries do. In the 1960s and 70s, Western historians began digging through forgotten newspapers and trial reports, searching for gunfighters whose names had been lost to time. Among them was a researcher named Robert K. DeArmond, a man obsessed with finding the truth behind the myth of the Old West. In his search, he found something unexpected, an English-born gambler mentioned in scattered headlines across Montana, Wyoming, and Nevada. One article called him a man impossible to kill. Another described him as the quietest killer in the territory. The name appeared again and again, John Bull. When DeArmond pieced the fragments together, He realized he'd uncovered the life of one of the most overlooked gunfighters in history, a man who lived through every age of the frontier and outlasted them all. In 1998, D. Arment included him in his book Deadly Dozen, Forgotten Gunfighters of the Old West, giving John Bull a place alongside names like Clay Allison and King Fisher. For the first time in almost 100 years, the world remembered, a voice from the past once the story reached modern readers. It spread like wildfire through historian circles, podcasts, and online archives. People were fascinated by the Englishman who never sought fame, who didn't fit the mold of the gunslingers Hollywood had sold them. John Bull wasn't a white-hatted hero or a black-hearted outlaw. He was human, flawed, reserved, endlessly tough. He didn't fight for justice or revenge. He fought for survival. And in a world addicted to dramatics, that quiet truth made his story feel real again. In a time where legends often shouted, John Bull whispered. And people started listening. Modern audiences saw something in John Bull that the old frontier stories had missed. He wasn't fearless, he was persistent. He wasn't charming, he was grounded. He didn't fight because he wanted to. He fought because he had to. In an age where survival itself was an act of courage, John Bull became the symbol of the ordinary man who endures the impossible. Historians began to compare him to figures of quiet resilience, men who didn't seek the spotlight but defined their times through endurance. In this way, John Bull became a mirror of the everyday hero, someone who doesn't win through power, but through patience. Then came the internet, and with it, a new kind of frontier, digital, vast, and untamed in its own way. Writers, filmmakers, and YouTube storytellers began digging for lost tales of the Wild West. And once again, the name John Bull surfaced. Blogs like The History Junkie and Glitter Knight published his story. Podcasts dramatized his duels, his partnership with Farmer Peel, and his miraculous survival through bullet wounds and amputations. Even AI-generated history channels began featuring him in their Forgotten Gunfighters series. Each retelling reached new listeners, thousands who had never heard of him before. And just like that, the man who once vanished from history became part of the digital campfire, his story told again and again, glowing against the black screen of the modern age. The world today isn't that different from John Bull's frontier. People still gamble with their luck, not with cards or bullets, but with choices, risks, and dreams. Everyone faces their own deserts and duels, moments where they must decide whether to fight, flee, or fold. That's what makes his story timeless. John Bull teaches that strength isn't about domination, it's about endurance. It's about keeping calm when the world turns chaotic, about standing up when no one's watching, and about walking away when pride would rather stay. He reminds us that survival itself can be noble. In his own quiet way, he was a philosopher with a gun. He showed that a man doesn't need to shout to be strong, he only needs to keep going. Today, if you type John Bull Gunman into a search bar, you'll find his story living again, across articles, videos, and biographies. You'll see black and white portraits of the man with the steady eyes. You'll read about the duel in Helena, the bullet in his chest, and the quiet death in Vancouver. Each retelling is a heartbeat, proof that legends, no matter how forgotten, never truly die. He's no longer just a name in a book. He's a symbol of something deeper, the idea that even the smallest story can echo through centuries if it's strong enough to survive the silence. If John Bull were alive today, he'd probably smile at the irony. A gambler from the 1800s becoming famous in the age of algorithms. He never cared for fame. He would have shrugged and said, stories are like cards, they find their players. But maybe he'd also be quietly proud. Not because the world finally noticed him, but because the truth finally caught up. Every generation rediscovers the kind of man John Bull was. The survivor who outlasts the noise. The one who doesn't quit when life turns violent. He stood between two worlds, the old and the new, and somehow belonged to both. In him, we see the spirit of every human being who's ever been underestimated, overlooked, or forgotten, yet refused to stay down. He reminds us that strength isn't always loud, that courage isn't always visible, and that sometimes the quietest people leave the loudest echoes. The West may have ended, but its lessons never did. And in the story of John Bull, there's a truth that belongs to every age. Survival is not luck, it's discipline. Legend is not fame, it's endurance. He didn't just live through history, he outlasted it. John Bull, the gambler who beat the odds, the gunman who wouldn't die, and the ghost who still walks the edges of the frontier. Reminding us all that time forgets the loud but never the strong. Every gambler knows there comes a final hand, that one moment when the cards are dealt and all the bluffing ends. For John Bull, that hand came quietly. No gunfire, no crowds, no glory, just an old man sitting by a window in Vancouver, watching the sunset paint the ocean gold, the same color of the dust that once drew him across the sea. He had lived long enough to see the world change around him. The horses were gone. The telegraph lines stretched where trails once wound through canyons. And men no longer settled their grudges with bullets, but with signatures and stamps. To most, that change was progress. To John, it was simply time doing what it always does, moving forward without asking permission. He'd survived it all: gunfights, mobs, betrayal, and loneliness. Now, at 93, his body was tired, but his eyes were still alive, sharp, curious, and full of memories. That evening, he shuffled a worn deck of cards across his small wooden table. He didn't play for money anymore. He played for the rhythm, the sound of the cards sliding together, the heartbeat of a life that had never quite stopped gambling. Sometimes, when the wind rattled the window, John would imagine he wasn't alone. He'd picture the faces of men long gone: Langford, Farmer Peel, the gamblers of Gold Creek, the miners of Austin. They'd sit around his table again, silent, their ghostly hands resting on invisible cards. No words were needed. Every man there had played his last hand already. John would nod to them and say softly, "You played hard, boys. Real hard." Then he'd take a sip of whiskey, set the deck down, and let the silence answer for them all. By the 1920s, most people had forgotten what the true West was like. Movies made it seem clean: black hats, white hats, neat endings. But the real frontier had been dirt, blood, fear, and luck. John Bull remembered the truth. He remembered nights when the only law was a man's nerve. He remembered friends who died before dawn, and enemies who shook his hand before drawing steel. He remembered the silence after a gunfight, that heavy, endless silence where you realized you were still breathing and someone else wasn't. Those memories never left him. They were carved into him like notches on a revolver's grip. One winter morning in 1929, John Bull didn't come downstairs for breakfast. The innkeeper knocked on his door. No answer. Inside, they found him sitting at his table, slumped slightly forward, his hat resting beside him. A single playing card, the ace of spades, lay face up before him. Some said he'd been playing one last game. Others thought he left it as a message, his final hand to the world. The ace of spades, the card of death. But also, in the language of gamblers, the card of triumph, the high card that beats them all. Maybe, for John Bull, it meant both. There was no funeral procession, no gun salute. The papers printed a short obituary. John Bull, English-born gambler and veteran of the frontier West, dies at 93. And then the world moved on. But that's the thing about legends. They don't need witnesses to endure. They live in the echo, in the stories people tell long after the last light fades. In death, as in life, John Bull didn't need attention. He had already played his part and won his game, not by riches or fame, but by survival. Decades later, writers would call him the man who refused to die. But maybe the truth was simpler. He wasn't unkillable, he was just unwilling to quit. And that's what makes his story matter. He reminds us that even when the odds are impossible, even when life deals you a bad hand, you still get to choose how you play it. John Bull's life was proof that courage isn't about never falling. It's about standing up one more time than you fall down. That's the Englishman's legacy. Not a bullet, not a grave, just a quiet kind of strength that outlasted the noise. Strip away the legend, and what's left is a man who wanted the same things we all do: freedom, respect, and a little peace. He wasn't perfect. He made mistakes, drew blood, and lived with guilt. But he also helped strangers, kept his word, and carried his honor in silence. He didn't write his story. Life wrote it for him, one risk at a time. And when it was done, he accepted it with grace. That's what separates the loud from the lasting. Today, when the sun sets over the empty plains of Montana or the old mining roads of Nevada, the land still feels like it remembers him. The wind hums softly through ghost towns and hollow saloons. The cards are gone, the revolvers rusted, but the spirit of men like John Bull lingers in the quiet, steady, calm, unafraid, because the frontier wasn't just a place. It was a state of mind, and John Bull carried it with him until his last breath. In the end, life is a table, and we are all gamblers. We don't control the cards we're dealt, only how we play them. Some play for glory, some play for gold. John Bull played for survival, and in that, he won every game. He crossed an ocean chasing freedom and found it in the dust and danger of a new world. He faced every storm with the same calm eyes. He lived long enough to see legends fade and time rewrite the rules, but it never rewrote him. His story closes not with a gunshot, but with a whisper, a reminder that even when the world forgets your name, it can never erase the way you lived. The cards have been dealt, the guns have gone silent, and the man who once walked through fire now sleeps beneath a quiet sky. But somewhere out on the wind, the echo remains, the sound of a deck shuffling, the click of a hammer, the heartbeat of a legend who wouldn't die. John Bull, the English gunman who outlasted the Wild West and won his final hand.